A young dancer in a black dress crosses a Los Angeles street set, and for a few seconds, the biggest star in the world stops moving entirely. 200 women had auditioned for the role. He watched the tapes once and picked her. What came after? A kiss on a Madison Square Garden stage, a silent firing, and more than 3 decades of a woman trying to explain a moment the public thought it already understood, is a story that rarely gets told past the headline. Stay with this one, because the full arc says more about fame, power, and being erased than any tabloid clipping ever did. Long before anyone connected her name to Michael Jackson, Tatiana Thumbtzen was already deep into a life built around discipline and performance. She was born Stephanie Yvonne Thumbtzen on April 22, 1960, in Clearwater, Florida, and by her own account she carries Black, Cherokee, and Cuban heritage, with the Thumbtzen surname coming from her adoptive father. Her path into modeling started almost by accident. According to an interview she gave years later, she was spotted in a ballet class by fashion photographer Barry Lategone, the same photographer credited with discovering the model Twiggy in the 1960s. That chance encounter pulled her toward fashion, and she eventually signed with a modeling agency in New York. Her first agency dropped her after a single week, telling her, in essence, that they didn't know how to market someone who didn't fit neatly into a racial category for their client roster. Another agency picked her up almost immediately, and work started coming in. That work eventually took her to Japan, where she spent roughly 5 years modeling before returning to the United States to pursue acting. By the mid-1980s she was bouncing between New York and Los Angeles, taking small television and film roles and building a portfolio. She has said that in 1984, while walking to a casting call in New York City, she spotted Michael Jackson on the street, dressed down in a plain shirt and a cap, seemingly unrecognized by anyone else around him. She followed him for several blocks, working up the nerve to say something, before realizing she was going to be late for her audition and had to turn back. She never got the chance to speak to him that day. 3 years later, she wouldn't need to. In 1987, Thumbtzen, then 27, went out on an audition through her agency without being told which artist or project it was for. The scene called for her to play a young woman being playfully pursued down a city street by a group of men. She ran through it once for a casting director while he recorded the tape. She later learned that more than 200 women had tried out for the same part, and that Michael Jackson made the final decision himself after reviewing the audition footage. According to Thumbtzen, one of the video's writers told her that Jackson's reaction on seeing her tape was immediate and decisive. He wanted her, full stop, and considered the other contenders essentially extras by comparison. The video was for The Way You Make Me Feel, the 3rd single from Jackson's Bad album. Directed by Joe Pytka and shot in June 1987, it was choreographed by Jackson alongside Vincent Patterson, with a visual language that borrowed heavily from West Side Story, a street of row houses, a crew of guys egging Jackson on, and Thumbtzen as the object of his pursuit, played out over nearly 10 minutes in its full-length version. Jackson's sister LaToya even turned up briefly as one of Thumbtzen's friends in the crowd. The chemistry on screen read as real because, by her account, some of it was. Thumbtzen has said Jackson flirted with her during the shoot. The video's original ending called for an actual kiss between the two characters, but Jackson reportedly asked the director to cut it, saying he was too shy to go through with it on camera. The scene was reworked into a hug instead, a small, telling detail about a performer who could command a stadium but apparently blanched at a scripted kiss with a co-star he was drawn to. The Way You Make Me Feel dropped on October 31, 1987, and became Jackson's 3rd consecutive #1 single from Bad. The video earned a nomination for Best Choreography at the 1988 MTV Video Music Awards, and almost overnight, Tatiana Thumbtzen became one of those faces that tens of millions of people would recognize on sight without necessarily knowing her name. The relationship didn't end when the cameras stopped rolling. In January 1988, Thumbtzen visited the set of Jackson's next short film, Leave Me Alone, and the two did a photo shoot together. Not long after, she was brought onto the Bad World Tour, at the time, the largest solo concert tour ever staged, to recreate her role from the video live on stage during performances of The Way You Make Me Feel, with Jackson chasing her across the stage in front of tens of thousands of fans a night. Being pulled into the biggest tour on the planet meant Jackson and Thumbtzen spent real time together, something that reportedly deepened both the professional bond. And, by her telling, a more personal one. Members of Jackson's extended family are said to have taken a liking to her during this stretch, even nicknaming her Tatiana Jackson. On March 2, 1988, she performed alongside him during the Grammy Awards at Radio City Music Hall, where Jackson opened the show with The Way You Make Me Feel, before later performing Man in the Mirror. She stood at his side for the opening number, on one of the biggest stages in American music that year. The very next night, March 3, 1988, Jackson headlined a star-studded benefit concert at Madison Square Garden for the United Negro College Fund, with a guest list that reportedly included Brooke Shields, Prince, Stevie Wonder, Lionel Richie, and Madonna. According to Thumbtzen, the two had almost no private time together during the tour, so during that first Garden show she made a spontaneous decision. She kissed Jackson on the cheek mid-performance. Dancers backstage later told her the moment landed, that Jackson could be heard giggling through the rest of the song. Encouraged by that reaction, she called him ahead of the following night's show to float the idea of pushing it further. By her account, they agreed on it together beforehand. During that second Garden performance, in front of a packed arena, she kissed Michael Jackson on the lips. The on-stage moment was electric. What happened backstage afterward was the opposite. Jackson's longtime manager, Frank Dilio, who had made a habit of complimenting her after every show, reportedly walked past her that night without a word, and with an expression she later described as openly hostile. Miko Brando, Marlon Brando's son and a close friend of Jackson's, confronted her backstage as well, apparently unaware that the kiss had been discussed and agreed upon by Jackson and Thumbtzen in advance. That last detail is the crux of the whole story. Nobody else on Jackson's team knew the kiss had been planned. To them, it looked like an unauthorized move by a dancer against the world's biggest pop star. Thumbtzen has said she believes that misunderstanding, combined with jealousy over the private conversation she and Jackson had shared, is what turned people against her almost immediately. Not long afterward, following a talk show appearance where she was asked directly about her relationship with Jackson and gave a guarded answer, Dilio made the decision to remove her from the tour. There was no conversation with Jackson himself, no explanation, and by her account no real closure of any kind. Just silence, followed by the news that singer Sheryl Crow, who had been performing backup vocals on the tour, would take over her on-stage role starting with the July 15, 1988, show at Wembley Stadium in London. For a woman who had shared a Grammy stage with Jackson barely 4 months earlier, the fall was sudden. She has said Jackson's mother, Catherine, was puzzled by the decision too, and continued inviting Thumbtzen to the Jackson family's Encino home afterward, a sign, at minimum, that the firing wasn't something the whole family stood behind. Jackson's father, Joseph, reportedly went further, offering to sign her to a management contract once she was off the tour. She eventually came to believe that arrangement wasn't helping her career and may even have been working against it, and the two parted ways professionally. Over the following months, she has said she tried repeatedly to reach Jackson directly at public events, only to be pulled away by handlers or blocked by walkie-talkie instructions from his team each time. Whether those instructions ever came from Jackson himself or simply from people managing his schedule is something she says she was never able to confirm. When she appeared on The Tonight Show with guest host Ross Schaefer and was asked point-blank whether she and Jackson were dating, she kept her answer professional, describing the relationship as strictly work-related, a carefully measured public line that stood in contrast to what she was privately going through. The professional fallout was real and lasting. Casting directors, she has said, came to see her only as the girl from the Michael Jackson video, which made it harder to be considered for other roles even as it kept her recognizable. She has also said she felt underpaid for the amount of work the video and tour generated, and that financial strain followed in the years after. She has written candidly about the emotional toll of being pulled off the tour, describing a period of serious depression, crying spells, a reluctance to leave the house, and stretches where she says she didn't want to go on living. It's a difficult admission, and one she's returned to across interviews and in her own writing rather than glossing over. Her public honesty has been complicated at points by her own admissions. In 1993, as Jackson faced his first child sexual abuse allegations, Thumbtzen made the media rounds. including an appearance on Howard Stern's radio show, where she claimed she and Jackson had carried on a romantic relationship for 18 months. She has since acknowledged in her own writing that those specific claims weren't accurate, an admission that opened her up to real criticism. What she has maintained consistently, though, separate from the exaggerated claims, is her defense of Jackson's character. She turned the broader story into 2 books, The Way He Made Me Feel, co-written with Tony Orion and published in 2005, and a follow-up, Michael and Tatiana, The King of My Heart, in 2011. In her own description, both books function more as autobiography than tell-all, tracing her life from childhood through Hollywood rather than dwelling on private details of her time with Jackson. She has said writing them was less about revelation and more about processing years of grief and unanswered questions, adding that putting the experience into words likely helped her get through one of the hardest periods of her life. Career-wise, she kept working through the years that followed, if never again at the scale of the Bad Era. A role in The Perfect Model, 1989, a part in Identity Crisis, 1989, an appearance as Sexy Girl on an episode of The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, 1990, and a spot in the opening credits of the sitcom A Different World, after being contacted by choreographer and producer Debbie Allen. None of it erased the association with Jackson. By her own admission, it never fully has, and likely never will. Time softened some of the harder edges of the story. Frank Dilio, the manager who fired her, remained a complicated figure in her memory for years, but the two reportedly reconciled and settled their differences shortly after Jackson's death in June 2009, not long before Dilio himself passed away in 2011. It didn't erase what happened in 1988, but it closed a chapter that had stayed painfully open for more than 2 decades. Katherine Jackson, who had stayed in touch with Thumbtzen off and on since the tour, invited her to Michael Jackson's funeral service at Forest Lawn Memorial Park on September 3, 2009. For a woman who had spent years being kept at arm's length from Jackson's inner circle, that invitation carried real weight, an acknowledgement, however quiet, that she had genuinely been part of his world. Thumbtzen has also spoken about how she processed Jackson's death itself. She learned the news from a friend while at work and has described the reaction as almost out-of-body, numbness, disbelief, days spent sleeping and crying before it fully registered. She's said that in the years since, she's largely stopped listening to music from that era altogether, finding it too tied to memories of him. She has continued to defend Jackson publicly, including in interviews given well after his death, describing him as a misunderstood genius rather than the strange or troubled figure often portrayed in the press. She has pushed back on the idea that her life has been permanently defined by that one video and tour, even as she acknowledges that to most fans, she will always be the girl from the Michael Jackson video, a label she says she's made peace with rather than one that broke her. Today, in her mid-60s, Tatiana Thumbtzen is best remembered for roughly 10 minutes of music video footage and one unscripted kiss on a New York stage, a moment that cost her a high-profile job almost overnight and reshaped the direction of her career. But reducing her story to that single incident misses most of what actually happened. A trained ballet dancer who built an international modeling career before she ever met Jackson, a woman who kept working steadily in film and television long after the tour ended, and someone who chose, more than once, to put her version of events on the record rather than let it be written by other people. What makes her account compelling isn't scandal. It's the ordinary cruelty of how quickly an industry, and the people around one enormously powerful man, could close ranks and remove someone without a word of explanation. She didn't do anything Jackson himself hadn't agreed to. She lost her spot on the tour anyway, and never got a direct answer as to why. Her story isn't really about Michael Jackson being extraordinary. History has already made that case. It's about what happens to the people who get close to that kind of fame and then find themselves discarded the moment their presence becomes inconvenient for the people managing it. Tatiana Thumbtzen spent decades absorbing that silence. What she did with it, writing, speaking, correcting her own record when she got things wrong, and refusing to let the story fade into a footnote, is its own kind of resilience, even if it rarely gets described that way. That's the fuller story behind the kiss the world thought it already knew. If you found this deep dive worthwhile, let us know in the comments, and stick around. There's another story just like this one coming up next. Sources consulted, Wikipedia entry for The Way You Make Me Feel, Jeff Pearlman's 2013 interview with Tatiana Thumbtzen, The Quaz, Michael Jackson Wiki, Fandom, Biographical entry on Tatiana Thumbtzen. IMDb credits for Tatiana Thumbtzen.